I've spent 11 years at Station 4 on Blackwood Peak, and in that time, I've learned that the forest doesn't like to be watched. It tolerates me. It allows me to sit in my glass box, 60 feet above the canopy, peering through binoculars like a voyeur, but it never lets me forget that I'm an outsider. I'm used to the silence. I'm used to the way the wind makes the steel stilts of the tower hum a low, flat B flat that vibrates in the soles of my boots. My life is measured in the ticking clock and the scratching of my pen against the heavy, cream-colored pages of the station ledger. But this morning, the rhythm was broken. I found the note tucked under the base of the Osborne firefinder. It wasn't there when I did my 10 p.m. sweep last night. It's a single sheet of yellowed paper, the edges brittle, with a single line of typewritten text. If you see smoke in the throat tonight, don't report it. Do not log it. Turn the firefinder to 180 degrees and look at the floor until the sun breaks the ridge. There's no signature, no ranger service seal. My first instinct was to check the stairs, but the trapdoor was still bolted from the inside. I was alone. I've been alone for 3 weeks. I spent the day just staring at that paper. I didn't eat. I watched the sun crawl across the floorboards, highlighting the dust motes that danced in the stagnant air. As the light began to fall, turning the valley into a deep, bruised purple, the air changed. The barometer on the wall didn't just drop. The needle slammed against the pin. My ears popped painfully. The Douglas firs below, usually swaying in the evening draft, went perfectly still. It was as if the entire world had been plunged into a vacuum. At 2 a.m., I saw it. It started in the Devil's Throat, a jagged limestone basin 5 miles to the east. It didn't look like a fire. There was no orange glow, no frantic flickering. Instead, a thick, oily gray vapor began to pour over the rim of the basin. It looked like smoke, but it moved with the heavy, rhythmic gait of something alive. It flowed down the slopes, swallowing the ancient timber in a slow-motion flood. I reached for the ledger, my habit of 11 years screaming at me to document the anomaly. My pen hovered over the observations column. 2:14 a.m. Heavy gray emission in Sector 4. Movement inconsistent with wind patterns. I stopped. I looked at that note again. The smoke wasn't rising. It was expanding, stretching out long, ropey tendrils that gripped the ridges. In the moonlight, I could see what it did to the trees. It didn't burn them. As the mist passed over a stand of pine, the green needles turned into a dull matte white. They didn't wither, they calcified. I watched through my binoculars as a gust of wind hit a smoked tree, and the entire thing shattered like a pillar of salt. Then, the smell hit me. It shouldn't have been possible. The tower was sealed, weather-stripped against the mountain winter, but the scent bled through the glass. It was wet, it smelled like copper, and the silt at the bottom of a stagnant pond. It was the smell of something very old being turned over in the mud. The vibration started in the steel legs of the tower. It was a slow, heavy pulse. It wasn't the wind. Something was putting its weight against the structure. I stood up, my knees locking. I looked down through the floor-level windows. The gray mist had reached the base of Blackwood Peak. It was climbing the granite face, bypassing the switchbacks, moving straight up the vertical rock. The tower lurched. My coffee mug slid off the table and shattered, but I didn't jump. I couldn't move. I watched as a thick, gray strand of the smoke coiled around the stairs. It didn't look like gas. It had kind of a texture. Fine, shimmering hairs that stood up as if it sensed the metal. The light in the tower changed. The moon was still up, but the glass was being frosted from the outside. Not by ice, but by a layer of that same gray, hairy residue. And that's when I remembered the note. I lunged for the firefinder. My hands shook so violently I could barely grip the bronze handles. I wrenched the sights away from the throat, spinning the heavy disc until the arrow pointed 180 degrees, directly at the blank western wall. I dropped to the floor. I pressed my forehead against the coal iron pedestal of the firefinder and squeezed my eyes shut. And that's when the sound started. It wasn't the wind. It was like a wet, rattling whistle, like a man trying to breathe through a throat full of pebbles. The sound was coming from right outside the glass. Something was circling the observation deck. I could hear the smoke skittering across the panes, thousands of tiny sharp points tapping against the glass. The tapping moved. It started at the east window, moved to the north, then stopped directly behind me at the west. I felt a sudden, sharp draft. The smell of copper became overwhelming. I knew, with a certainty that made my skin crawl, that the smoke didn't need a door to get in. It was seeping through the seals, pooling on the floorboards just inches from my boots. I kept my eyes on the floor. I watched a single gray filament, thin as a spider's silk, drift across my field of vision. It swayed back and forth, tasting the air, searching for the heat of my breath. I held my lungs until they burned. I didn't look up. I didn't scream. Outside, the whistling breath grew louder, more frantic. The glass groaned as if a massive weight was against it, testing the strength of the frame. I just stared at the wood grain of the floor and waited for the sun. The sun didn't rise so much as the world simply curdled into a sickly, pale yellow. I didn't move for a long time. I stayed curled around the fire finder, my muscles locked in a permanent cramp, waiting for that wet, rhythmic whistling to return. But the only sound was the expansion of the steel joints as the first rays of light touched the tower. I finally forced my eyes open. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It was vacuum sealed. No morning birds, no wind, not even the hum of the forest floor. I stood up slowly, my joints popping like dry kindling, and looked at the windows. The gray frost was gone. The glass was clear, but it did look different, pitted and warped, as if it had been washed in acid. I stepped toward the eastern pane, my heart hammering a dull rhythm against my ribs. The forest was gone, not vanished, but transformed. The 30,000 acres of Douglas fir and ponderosa pine I had watched for over a decade had been turned into a graveyard of white, calcified stalks. The valley didn't look like timber anymore. It looked like a field of bleached bone. Every needle, every branch, every trunk was a matte, chalky white. There was just no green, no brown, just the blinding, unnatural pale of the exhale. I felt a surge of nausea. I stumbled back to my desk, reaching for my ledger. I needed to document this. I needed to see my own handwriting to prove to myself that I was still the person who had sat down here yesterday. I opened the book to the last entry. My breath hitched. Below my unfinished note from 2:14 a.m., there was a new line. The ink was still wet, a dark shimmering violet that looked like bruised skin. The handwriting was a perfect, terrifying imitation of my own, the same slanted E's, the same hurried S's. 4:12 a.m. The window is thin. He almost looked. We will try the door tomorrow. I dropped the pen. It clattered against the floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. We. I didn't write that. I knew I hadn't. I had been on the floor, my eyes squeezed shut, with my hands over my ears. But the ink was there, drying on the page, a physical tether to whatever had been tapping on the glass. I looked at the door, the heavy oaken steel trapdoor that led to the 60-foot drop. The bolt was still thrown, but as I stared at it, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. A thin trail of gray ash led from the door's seal to the center of the room. It wasn't ash from a fire. It was fine, like pulverized bone. It followed the exact path I had taken to when I crawled for the fire finder, and there, right when I had been huddling, was a single gray filament. It was thin as a human hair, about 6 inches long, and it was moving. It wasn't blowing in a draft. It was standing on one end, swaying in a slow, hypnotic circle, as if it were still tasting the air for the scent of my fear. I grabbed a glass jar, an old mason jar I used for pens, and slammed it over the hair. It didn't try to escape. It just continued its rhythmic swaying inside the glass, tapping a tiny frantic tink-tink-tink against the walls of the jar. I needed to leave. I didn't care about the memo. I didn't care about the job. I grabbed my pack, throwing in my water rations and my first aid kit. I reached for the door handle, but I stopped. I looked through the floor-level windows at the stairs. The stairs were also white. The steel grating, the handrails, the bolts, everything had been coated in that same chalky, brittle substance. And sitting on the third landing, looking straight up at the tower, was a deer. Or at least, it had been a deer. It was standing perfectly still, its head tilted at an impossible 90-degree angle, Its fur was gone, replaced by that matte white calcification. Its eyes were two hollow pits of gray smoke. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It just stood there, a statue of rot, waiting for the door to open. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. I looked back at the ledger. The violet ink was changing. The words were blurring together, forming new shapes. I watched, paralyzed, as the sentence, "He almost looked," began to rearrange itself. The letters crawled across the paper like ants. They settled into a new sentence. It said, "The sun is a different kind of dark, Tom. Open the window. Let the air out." The jar on my desk shattered. The gray filament fell and started rising. It floated into the air, joining dozens of others that were beginning to seep out from under the floorboards, from behind the maps, from inside the very walls of the tower. The smoke wasn't outside anymore. It was the tower itself. It was the wood, the steel, the glass. It had been eating the station while I slept, and now it was finished with the shell. It wanted the heart. I grabbed the firefinder, my only anchor in the shifting room. I looked out the western window, desperate for a glimpse of the world that wasn't white. Far off on the horizon, toward the next station, I saw a thin ribbon of gray smoke rising. A real fire, a normal, honest fire. I reached for the signal mirror. My hand was inches from it when the glass of the western window began to ripple. Not crack, ripple. Like the surface of a pond. A face began to push through the glass. It had no eyes. It had no mouth. It was just a hollow impression in the warped pane, a mask made of gray mist. It pressed closer, the glass stretching like plastic, until the nose of the thing was inches from my own. And then it spoke. Not into my ears, but directly into my skull, in the voice of the wind through the pines. "Report the smoke, Tom. Tell him we're coming home." The ripple in the glass didn't snap back. The window remained distorted, a permanent warped funnel pointing directly at my throat. I backed away until my spine hit the opposite pane, but there was no safety there. The glass behind me felt soft, like a half-cured resin. I looked down at my hands. The skin around my cuticles was turning a dull, matte gray. I rubbed them against my denim jeans, but the color didn't come off. It wasn't on me, it was under the skin. The sun, now high above the ridge, offered no comfort. The light it cast over the bleach-white forest was flat and sterile. Everything out there was a statue. I saw a hawk frozen mid-dive, its wings crystallized into white jagged fans, suspended forever above a thicket of bone-dry bush. I realized then that I wasn't waiting for the night anymore. The night had already won. It had simply left the lights on so I could watch the transition. I looked back at the ledger. The violet ink had bled through the page, soaking into the wood of the desk. New words were carving themselves into the grain, bypassing the paper entirely. "The tower is along, Tom. Breathe with us." The whistling started again, but it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the firefinder. The hollow bronze pedestal was acting like a flute, the air inside it vibrating with that wet, rhythmic rattle. I understood the memo now. It wasn't from Miller. It wasn't from the district. It was the forest's way of keeping me still while it set the table. If I had reported the smoke, I would have triggered the emergency response. Planes would have dropped slurry. Men would have arrived with chainsaws. They wouldn't have saved me, but they would have disrupted the exhale. By staying silent, I had allowed the vacuum to seal. I had given the throat the silence it needed to finish the change. I reached into my bag and pulled out the only thing I had left, the flare gun. It felt impossibly heavy. The orange plastic was the only vibrant color left in the room. I looked at the signal mirror, then at the flare. If I fired it, someone at Station 5 might see. They would call it in. They would send a helicopter. But then I looked at the deer in the landing. It hadn't moved, but its eyes, those pits of gray smoke, were wider now. It wasn't a corpse, it was a doorway. If a helicopter came, the pilot would breathe this air. He would take the gray filaments back in his lungs. He would land at the base, and he would cough. The forest wasn't trying to kill me. It was trying to use me to leave. I looked at the jar of the pens on my desk. I grabbed the matches I used for my morning coffee. My hands were almost entirely gray now, the texture of my skin feeling like fine grit sandpaper. I could feel the calcification moving up on my forearms, stiffening my elbows. I didn't fire the flare into the sky. Instead, I walked to the center of the room. I knelt by the ledger, the record of my 11 years of witness. I struck a match. The flame was small, a tiny, defined flick of orange in a world full of gray. I dropped it onto the ledger. The violet ink flared up with a hiss. It didn't burn like paper, it burned like magnesium, a blinding white-hot light that ate through the desk in seconds. The gray filaments in the air shriveled, making a sound like 1,000 tiny screams. The whistling in the firefinder turned into a screech. I grabbed the kerosene jug from under the sink. My movements were slow, my joints grinding like stones. I poured the oil all over the floorboards, over the maps, over the warped glass windows. The smell of the kerosene was beautiful, harsh, chemical, and real. It cut through the scent of the wet copper like a knife. The face in the glass pushed further in, the mask becoming a desperate swirling vortex of mist. "Don't," the wind screamed in my head. "We are almost whole." I struck the second match. I looked out one last time at the white forest. I hoped the fire would be enough. I hoped that when the heat hit those calcified trees, they would burn with a normal, cleansing flame instead of just shattering into more dust. "I'm reporting the smoke," I whispered. My own voice sounded strange to me, human, fragile, and final. I dropped the match. The roar was instantaneous. The kerosene ignited in a wall of orange, the heat hitting my face like a physical blow. For a second, the gray world vanished. The red of the flames, the color returned. The black suit, the orange of the heat, all started to mix together. The tower groaned as the fire began to eat at the wooden floorboards. The glass panes, already weakened by the smoke, shattered outward, the pressure of the heat blowing them into the abyss. I sat in the center of the circle, watching the fire climb the bronze pedestal of the firefinder. The heat was unbearable, but it felt good. It felt like being alive one last time. Through the rising smoke, real, black, choking smoke, I saw the white trees below start to catch. They didn't burn gray, they burned bright and hot. I closed my eyes. I didn't look at the floor. I didn't follow the rules. I just listened to the sound of the world finally starting to scream. The last thing I felt wasn't the cold gray mist. It was the sun.